A few months ago, I sat in a room of local nonprofit leaders with a facilitator in a group discussion. And the facilitator posed us a question. She said, if you could solve one world problem with your nonprofit, what would that be? Now, I'm a museum director, a former historian, cultural leader in my organization. I once worked in the field as an archaeologist. And sitting around this room with other organizers, leaders in nonprofits, I thought to myself, well, what do museums really do to solve world problems, right? We're places that engage, educate, we're a tourist spot, people come to see artifacts, art, all of these things. But we don't really solve world problems, do we? So, as we went around the room and it got to me and all of these other, leaders answered hunger, poverty, discrimination, I paused and I had a real vulnerable moment and got to me and I replied with empathy. Now, museums don't often think of themselves as solving or creating empathy, but I think that they truly can invoke that. And I don't think that we can rid the world of unsympathetic people. We can't make people be nice. But I think that we can truly have moments where we invoke true, real empathy in our visitors and our audience. And in doing so, it creates an opportunity for people to see a point of view that is no longer their own. It puts them out of their shoes. Because really, if you can see the world from a different perspective, just for a moment, walk away and gain that understanding, wouldn't we be closer to solving the world's problems if you understood other individuals' struggles, or other society struggles, or other community struggles, that you would be able to be more apt to find the solution? So Roman Krzarik, in his work, talks about how needed empathy is in our society right now. That there are huge challenges in real, true human connections with the way that we've developed in technology. And one of those is, perhaps the advent of the cell phone, the internet, Facebook, all of these things. That these, yes, they connect us to other people, but are they really, really, truly invoking a human connection, a real one? And the other challenge, I think, that empathy faces now in our ongoing society that museums can help with is the push on science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. That these subjects, and I know they're important, they're black and white, right? They're facts, they're answers. One isn't almost one, it is one. There's no gray area there, it's black or white. And then I think the other kind of issue that museums might face, or our society challenges right now, is the idea that this is people's perspectives of, in particular, history museums, right? Of course, like any millennial, I Googled, and I said, what does a history museum look like? Just to see what maybe Google's perception and maybe the public perception was. This, to me, is cold, stark, almost looks like a palace. It's a little bit untouchable, unconnectable, unreal to most people, and essentially unempathetic. So, what are museums? And I'm focusing specifically now on history and cultural museums and how we can invoke empathy. We are sometimes people believe that we are the authority on subjects, and we are in some ways, some shape, some form. We're artifacts, and of course, we come alive at night because this is the Hollywood perspective of what museums are, right? But why history? Why history museums? Why museums of history and culture are uniquely set in order to create empathy in our visitors and our audiences? And I believe history is the big piece of this. And it's because that you really start to begin and understand through exhibits, through experiences, that this is the way the world works, right? We had these events in the past, they've come to a conclusion, they happen, they understand why, the reasons, we understand the gray, right? Not the black, not the white, but the gray, the in-between. And why study history? Why should people come to history museums to invoke empathy, and how can we do that? History allows you to see the world from another point of view. So back to kind of me in this room, in this answering with empathy to how we solve the world's problems, and the study of history and the visitation of museums. I asked myself when I went back to work, I said, how can we do this? So over the past couple of months, I've been thinking really hard about this. First things first, you ask the 4 W's in the how, right? Why, what, who, what, when, where, how. And first thing is, who do we want to impact? Our visitors, our audience, anyone who really engages with our museum. And the second is, what do we want them to take away? Well, here, I want people to take away a sense of empathy. And I don't mean, huge, social change empathy. I mean, just that moment. Because empathy is learned, right? It's not an innate human kind of thing. It's something that you can learn throughout your life. And then specifically, where and when does it happen in museums, especially history museums? And then why museums should be doing this. Because, that former look of that palace-like museum, that scary history museum, that authority, his museums are changing. They are no longer a place for that. They are a place where they're alive. They can engage. You can go there for a community conversation. And then how can we continue to do it? So right now, I'm going to talk about 4 ways that I think history museums can invoke empathy and where I've seen empathy become a piece and a takeaway from that. And there are 4 things that are essential. The first is an experiential learning experience. The second is immersive. The third is by invoking imagination. And the fourth, I'll get to when I get there. So the first experiential learning piece that I want to speak about and where someone can take away an opportunity for empathy or invoke empathy is experiential learning. When I once worked up at the USS Constitution Museum in Boston, and that's the ship, right, not the paper. This is the ship in the water and the museum that supports that engagement. They had an exhibit that focused on the War of 1812 and what it was like to serve aboard as a sailor during that time. Now, what you're seeing here is an exhibit, an interactive, where a young girl is actually holy stoning the deck. Now, this was a task that all sailors had to do on board the ship during 1812, especially if you were a common sailor, not an officer per se. Now, she's on the ground with a stone. She's on her hands and knees, and she's actually scrubbing wood planks with sand, and on board the ship, they would have used salt water. Now, can you imagine what that would have been like in the ice-cold weather, in the hot weather of summer, as the ship is tipping to and fro? Now, this young girl probably walked away saying, oh, that's not a really fun experience, right? It was sandy, it was grainy, it was I always often kind of compared it to nails on a chalkboard. And one of the school program brochures that the USS Constitution Museum puts out, there's a 10-year-old quote on it that says, "I know what life was like now. I didn't realize that before." These exhibits and their experiential piece of using the senses and interacting with something and a real piece in history actually, I believe, invoked empathy in any of the visitors that actually experience it. So the second is immersion, right? This image is from the Chicago History Museum, and of course, one of those important soul components of Chicago's history is the hot dog, right? Well, guess what? You can immerse yourself and be the hot dog. Now, immersive experiences aren't necessarily about immersing yourself in water or as the hot dog, but it's really a full sensory experience. It's really immersing yourself in that history, in that period, in that cultural piece. And I do believe that maybe you had some sense of hot dog when you walked out of there. And you can't do this alone either. You have to have a social connection with other people to help you immerse yourself in this experience. And as you're doing it, you're talking about it, right? You're immersing yourself in the culture of this piece of history. The third is invoking imagination. Now, I'm the current director of the Institute for American Indian Studies, a museum and research center in Washington, Connecticut. And this piece, this is our village. It's a reproduction, pre-contact, native Northeast village with wigwams and weetus. Now, the village itself is not outfitted. It is simply the wigwams, the weetus, and sometimes a campfire when we have school programs. But I do believe when people walk up here, they have a sense of imagination. And I've heard people walk away saying, wow, that's really cool. This is a new thing for them. This is not something they would have ever seen. But just being in this space, being in the woods, not hearing cars, not hearing airplanes, being a part of this really invokes your imagination to really creatively think about what it was like to live at this place, in this space, hundreds of years ago. And I do believe that invoking the imagination is one of the most important parts of empathy, right? Because you're not really experiencing the world from that other person's point of view. You're not really walking in their shoes, but you have to be able to imagine that possibility. And creatively thinking, where does our imagination go as we grow older? Is this something that only children can experience? I don't think so. I think invoking the imagination at museums and thinking about that history piece is an opportunity, and it can be relearned as you grow older. I also believe this is almost very difficult for many history museums to do, because we are those places for the authority. We want to be able to give you facts, real history, and make sure that knowledge is correct, that we're giving to you, giving to our visitors, giving to our audience. And this opportunity, although real, and it's somewhat, it's a reproduction piece, allows people to walk through and experience it, but also imagine themselves in that place. And that's why I think something like this is very important to invoke empathy. And that fourth piece, it has to be real, and it has to be compelling. Now, how do you create a compelling program? How do you do that? I'm going to take you through two experiences that I was a part of, where I actually saw a group of people invoking empathy through the programs that museums hosted. The first program was at the Noah Webster House and West Hartford Historical Society, and it was a community conversation about the issue of Native mascotry in the town, so the portrayal of Native people as mascots. Now, this is something that's come up again and again in contemporary issues, right? This isn't necessarily historical, but these mascots, these words that are used to represent schools, they carry weight, and they carry history, and they carry cultural significance, especially for Native people, contemporary Native people who are in our world today. Now, the town of West Hartford was engaging in this conversation and did finally come to a decision. But during this program that was hosted by the Noah Webster House, they heard from a Native person, and that person lived on a reservation. He spoke about the experience of moving from the reservation to attending Dartmouth College, whose mascot is a Native individual. And I watched as the entire audience had this moment of seeing and invoking a sense of empathy for this person as he spoke about his experience and how it did mentally affect him, and that it did actually have, a negative effect on his experience, on his college experience and his social experience. And not understanding until that point, till hearing from his point of view at this program, at this museum, that many people in the audience had no idea. And I watched as people came up to him and spoke to him and said, "Thank you. I had no idea that you felt this way, that maybe there's other people that feel this way too." And that is a real compelling piece that a museum can support. And he spoke about the history of mascots and all of this, and it just really invoked a sense of empathy from those people who participated in that program. So the second real compelling piece that History Museum supported that I was able to be involved with, lucky enough to be involved with, was from the Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center. The Research Center currently has an active program going on called Battlefields of the Pequot War. It's a research program, and it's based on defining, identifying, and preserving battlefields that took place in Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and New York during 1636 and 1637. Now, these battlefields, like Manassas, like Gettysburg, are there. They still exist. It was a place of, if you look at the idea of war, a terrible case for the Pequot who were involved in that war. And it did lead to a significant change in their culture. And we were able to actually identify and archaeologically dig the sites of where these battlefields were to identify them. Now, right now, they aren't preserved like Manassas and Gettysburg, where everybody knows these things exist. These battlefields are in people's backyards. They are in neighborhoods. They are not preserved for the future just yet, but they will be, right? And this was a huge endeavor by the Mashantucket Pequot Museum because they really did have to gain an understanding from the neighborhoods that they were going to be working in. They had to create a human connection with the people that they were able to work with and be able to dig and archaeologically define where these battlefields were. And I watched as an entire neighborhood, one by one, start to begin to understand the implications of actually doing this work and supporting the preservation for their community, for their history. And one by one, people came over and said, I get it now. I understand why this is important to the Mashantucket Pequot community. I understand why it's important to our history here in town. And we want to make sure we help preserve that in the future. They began to understand this point of view that was no longer, or there was in the beginning, not their own. It invoked a sense of empathy in them to be a part of this project, to be involved in this project. So I do believe, as a non-Native person who is the current director of a Native American cultural museum, that empathy is a key element in the way museums and history museums can really engage with their public, their audience. Now, do I think that empathy has the power to create social change? Possibly, yes, definitely. I watched it happen in that small room with that group of people who heard our Native speaker during that Native mascot discussion. I watched an entire neighborhood who did not essentially support an engagement now support it. And do I think it can? Yes. Do I think museums can solve the problem? Maybe. But I do believe that it allows us to anticipate the future, people's needs, by the Chicago History Museum, I think supports it best. And I really want to see museums become that social opportunity for change in the future. Thank you.